DevelopSec, Developing Security Awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of the DevelopSec podcast. I am your host, James Jardine, and today I want to talk a little bit about file shares. As a tester, these are one of the biggest things we find as ways to get great information while we're doing internal pen tests is stumbling across these file shares that have inaccurate or incorrect permissions set on them that allow too much access. How many times have you sat there with some documents and you thought, hey, I need to get this to somebody else, or I need to make it available, so I just create a share maybe on my desktop, maybe we create it on a server someplace, and we just create a file share and then put our documents out there. But how often do we really think about the permissions we give to that file share and who can actually see it and what type of data are we sticking out there? Of course, maybe we have sensitive data. We don't want to email it. So it makes sense. Maybe we stick it on a share internally. Somebody else who needs it can go grab it. It's easy. And it, makes it so much easier for our other people to go ahead and grab that. So they do make sense, but we really have to think about permissions and what's out there. I can tell you from experience doing lots of pen tests that oftentimes when we're on site or we're doing some form of internal assessment and we're doing scans, we find file shares that have mounds of information. It actually is so much better for us than what the client may actually think. I mean, these file shares often contain very sensitive information that oftentimes nobody even is aware that they're out there. I mean, it's usually fairly simple for users to go out and create their own file shares, or you get somebody that's got some administrative rights and creates a file share on a dev server or on a test server someplace. Even worse, you're using production servers that are available to everybody in the business, but you're sticking all your web code out there because that's how you transfer it from one machine to another. You just stick it in a file share to get it over there. Well, this can cause big problems. Many times we find these file shares, and the first problem is just too lax of permissions. Okay, we've got a file share. Who has access to it? And oftentimes it's everyone or everybody within the domain. And that causes a big problem because, whatever document I have, is that really for everybody? Maybe there's some HR documents that make sense of, hey, here's our holiday schedule and here's our handbook, and, simple manuals like that may make sense to be open to everybody. But when you start thinking about putting up forms that are uploaded, forms that have sensitive information, maybe application forms or anything like that, well, now that becomes a little bit more, who should have access to that? What information is stored in those forms? Are there social security numbers? Are there birth dates? Are there credit card numbers, bank account information? All this information, right, is a concern. So if it contains customer or employee data like that, are you putting it on a share? And if so, how are you protecting that data on that share so the average user within the company doesn't have access to it? We need to make sure that only the people that should have access to it have access to it. Other information we find great in some of these documents, especially if we get to web code, we find like a web.config, we find some sort of web.xml or other configuration file that leads us into database credentials, then leads us into being able to access the database. And now you've got bigger issues depending on how you've locked down your database. But say we get into an HR database, say we get into the user database for a major website. Well, now we have access to all that data that's in there. So if there's, credit card numbers or social security numbers, passwords, all that stuff is now available to swipe real quick. And then if there's any encryption or anything like that, we can try doing that. If it's in plain text, even better. But we often don't think about these things. So we have to think about who has access to these shares. And from a company standpoint, we need to do a better job of scanning our network. It's all too often that we go into places and, the biggest problem we see is shares, right? These shares are leading to the biggest compromises within the system. Obviously, there's other issues like unpatched software and rogue websites and that type of thing. But shares usually contain a lot of information for us. So as a company, we need to start looking and doing a better job at scanning our networks, looking for these file shares that are out there and looking at the information that's in them. Why does a regular user have access to this file share? It's difficult. Lots of companies, right? They have lots of shares. They have lots of servers. So how do you go out to each person who owns that share and lock it down and find out, well, who should have access to this? Because this type of information shouldn't be available to everybody. So it's a burden, right, to try to come out and manage all of this. But we have to start doing it because this is a great way for somebody, even internal, just a regular user, to start getting sensitive information that we don't want to get leaked out. From a user standpoint, we want to start getting better at thinking about, one, what do we put in those shares? And two, if we're creating our own share, who has access to it? And if we're putting stuff into a share that already exists, who has access to that share? If you're throwing something into a share that's got sensitive information, don't just assume that only the HR group has access, right? We need to check that. Go into the properties of it. See what groups have access to that. And if everyone's in there, maybe we shouldn't be throwing, some sensitive materials in there. It falls on everybody. It's not just administrators and networking guys and security guys auditing these things, but it's also us users that have to be aware of what's going on and understand what we're putting into these directories. Because when we start putting this stuff out there and then we just leave it out there, somebody's going to come along later on, see some great information. Oh, hey, here's some database credentials. Let's see what's in this database. And you get in the database and there's, a whole bunch of social security numbers and first names and last names and address and phone number and email. Wait a minute, I shouldn't have been able to see that. And I probably wouldn't have seen that. But because there was an open share, I got access very quickly. So the general thought for the day, or for the week, I guess, since this is just a weekly podcast, is really, we always think of sharing as caring, but oversharing is not caring, right? We want to make sure that we're not oversharing our data and oversharing these folders. So that way we help create a better, more secure environment. So that wraps up today. Nice and short, but straight to the point. And we'll cover more next week. So have a great week. You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.